Scale Up Nation, one of my favorite things about the Rising Tide Mastermind is a session that we do called a full cup. And a full cup is where we bring a tip or a trick to each other that can really help improve our regular day-to-day. And a few months back, Eric Russo, member of the Mastermind and has been on the podcast several times, he brought to us the Rocket Book. Folks, the Rocket Book is amazing. The Rocket Book allows you to take notes just like you would on any other notebook, but it has a scanning feature that turns what you write into searchable text. It makes your notes able for you to find. This was a game changer for me, and I know it can be a game changer for you. We have an affiliate deal worked out with the Rocket Book, folks, so you can go to scalinguph2o.com/rocketbook, and you can receive 15% off your first order of $20 or more. Welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast, the podcast where we scale up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. I'm Trace Blackmore. I get to host this really awesome podcast. Thank you for listening. And of course, as a listener, you know that we call you the Scaling Up Nation. And so many people out there in the Scaling Up Nation, I want to thank you for listening each and every week, but not only listening, but also participating. Folks, we are on 368. That's the number of this episode, and we're going to hit episode 400 this year. And I want to make sure that we have at least 400 more in store for you. And the only way that that is going to happen is when you let me know what you want me to talk about, when you let me know who you want me to interview, when you have a question that you want me to answer. So if you have any or all of those, please get that information to us as quickly as you can by going to scalinguph2o.com, going over to our show ideas page and letting us know whatever that information is that you have, and we will be sure to put that in our future list. I love the show Dirty Jobs. They actually brought it back last year. I'm hoping it comes back for another season this year. Mike Rowe has one of those amazing voices, and he is just a very charismatic host. And I got the idea for asking the audience what we need to be doing from him. And he said he did it for fun on the very first few episodes, but quickly ran out of ideas. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. We have been very fortunate. We have never run out of ideas, but I do not want to pull too hardly on that thread. I want to make sure we always have plenty of things to talk about. So I am going to activate the row like I do on most podcasts. And I am going to ask you for anything you can let us know about interviews, guests, or questions. Go ahead and go to scalinguph2o.com. Go over to our show ideas page. Nation, something that I get so much feedback on whenever I go to a trade show or conference is how much people enjoy going to the one-stop shop of the scalinguph2o.com events page, because they know anything to do with our industry is going to be listed in that events page. So, Nation, here are a few events that you want to make sure you get on your calendar. The first item is the Hang. On July 11th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we are going to be conducting a Hang. And a Hang is a networking event for you, the Scaling Up Nation. And this is one of my favorite things to do because listeners of the podcast, they dial in to Zoom. Is that what you do to Zoom? Do you dial in? Do you type in? Do you hit enter and you get in? Everybody knows how to get into Zoom. I'm not sure what the verb is to use for that. But we have a Zoom link that you will register for, and we will start promptly at 6 p.m. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the industry, and then I'm going to get you into breakout rooms. And this is where the fun starts because you're going to be able to network with people within the industry. I'll normally give you a few questions that you can talk about amongst the group, and you are going to walk away from that with somebody new that you did not know before. And here's the cool thing. Here's the magic thing, because I've seen it happen each and every hang. You will meet somebody that maybe can help you out right now with the problem that you are having, or maybe you don't have a problem right now. And then 10 months down the road, you have an issue and you think, I remember that person that I met on a hang and I've got their contact information and they can solve that problem for you. Nation, that is the magic of the hang. We also have a lot of fun in the process. So you can register for the hang on July 11th. You can register now by going to scalinguph2o.com/hang. And I look forward to seeing you there. The American Waterworks Association 2024 Annual Conference and Expo, known as ACE 24, is taking place June 10th through 13th in Anaheim, California. And we'll have all the information that you need to know about the ACE show by going to scalinguph2o.com and navigating over to our events page. While you're there, you can also check out the 2024 Utility Leadership Conference and 54th Annual Meeting hosted by the National Association of Clean Water Agencies. That's taking place July 23rd through 26th in Buffalo, New York. Nation, if we know about it, it's on that events page, and then you can know about it, and then you can go and you can increase your knowledge about whatever it is that you are trying to learn more about. But not only increase your knowledge, you're going to increase your network. And I can't tell you how many times I have reached out to people that I have met at shows just like this to help me with issues and questions that I have had. Nation, it's all about who you know in this industry, because you will know somebody that will be able to answer that question that you have. Nation, you might remember Barry Higgins back on episode 353 and 354. Barry is our friend from Ireland that came and talked about boilers. And I want to thank Ireland. Ireland has rated the Scaling Up H2O podcast in the top 100 of all podcasts downloaded in Ireland on Apple, but it's just not 100. We're actually ranked number 66 out of all podcasts. Nation, that is an amazing statistic. So I love Ireland. I was over there a couple of years ago. We got to tour the most beautiful countryside. And so Ireland, thank you for being part of the Scaling Up Nation. Thank you for making us the 66th most downloaded podcast in Ireland. And it is my hope that you continue to listen to Scaling Up H2O and share it with as many friends as possible. Well, Nation, speaking of friends, you're getting ready to hear from one of mine. Here is the interview. My lab partner today is returning guest Tim Fulton. Tim, welcome back to the Scaling Up H2O podcast.
Hey, Trace, it's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
Tim, we were trying to count the times, and I did a horrible job of doing that before you came on. I know you've been on at least twice, because you were on episode 22, one of our original episodes, and then most recently, episode 280, where we talked about talent. It's at least, another 2 times on top of that?
It may be, and I feel fortunate every time I'm asked to come back.
Tim, can you tell us what you've been up to since we've seen you last on episode 280?
Sure. So I've been doing a lot of speaking. I was a Vistage Chair for 16 years, and just before COVID, it's funny how everything is before and after COVID.
That's how we tell time now.
Right. Before COVID, I retired. I transitioned my groups because it was ready time for a new season, of my life, and began doing a lot of speaking to Vistage groups, which I continue to do now. This week I was in Los Angeles. Last week where was I last week? I think I was in Cleveland last week. So going to different cities, speaking to different groups, different Vistage groups, which I very much enjoy. I also, like yourself, I've got my own mastermind group that I facilitate here in Atlanta. I got lured back to Vistage, and I've got 2 Vistage groups that I co-chair what's called an advancing leader group, emerging leader group. And then I've got about a dozen coaching clients that I work with. Each month I meet with and help in different variety of different ways. So, Trace, it's nice. I've got kind of a convergence of different things that I'm doing now. It seems to be a healthy mix. I'm probably working more than what I had expected. And so slowly I'm trying to do a little bit less, but probably most importantly, I continue to really enjoy what I'm doing.
And you recently received an award from Vistage.
I did. For the second consecutive year, I was recognized as a top speaker. They've got several hundred speakers that go out and speak to the Vistage groups, and somehow I found myself in the top tier of those speakers and was named a top speaker. I'm very thankful for that.
Well, Nation, I love having Tim on the podcast. Tim is one of my mentors, one of my heroes. Tim, you and I met, I want to say it was probably 15 years ago.
Yes, close, I think.
Tim hosted a series with the Small Business Administration called Grow Smart. Mm-hmm. And I was in that course, and Tim took us through like this intensive 6-week crash course to an MBA, I think I would call it. Is that an accurate way to describe it?
Yes. And for your listeners, you were at the top of your class. I don't know whether you realize we were grading and you were at the top of your class.
It was every Friday. It was all day Friday. It was my favorite day of the week, not just because it was Friday. And you did such a great job of bringing so much information to each and every class. And every Friday, it was a different subject. Like we would talk about HR. We would talk about marketing. One of the courses we had was how do we put Trace out of business? And you put me in the middle of the course on a stool and you tried to figure out my blind spots. And I think we met 6 times, and I just loved that. And then on the 6th day, I had the realization that there wasn't a 7th day. And I was really upset. And I said, Tim, I don't want this to end. And you said, well, I'm glad you said something. And then you invited me into your Vistage group. And I believe I was in that group with you for about 10 years.
Yes, I think so. The Trusted Advisor Group. Yes.
And that was just phenomenal. That was my first introduction into a mastermind type group. You had to explain what it was to me. And then once I was introduced to the group, and talk about a friendly, inviting group. I mean, the group of people within our group was just amazing. I felt like I was a member on the very first day. And we were able to process issues and just share with the wealth of knowledge and experience of everybody in that room. And you were the conductor of that. And you just, I really admire how you facilitate. I facilitate now. And I tell you, when in doubt, I just ask myself, what would Tim Fulton do? And I try to channel Tim Fulton. Tim, you have taught me so much about facilitation, how to do it right. I want to say thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome, Trace. And it was always, you were a great addition to the group. And it's just so cool to see how now you're leading the class. You're in front of the class, and you're doing so well with your mastermind groups. It's fun to see where this has taken you.
I don't think I've ever shared this on the podcast, but since you're here, I'm going to share it. You and I met at a Chick-fil-A for lunch. I think it was right before COVID. And you and I on a napkin figured out how to launch your mastermind and how I was going to launch my mastermind. And then we had a deadline. We were holding each other accountable that we were going to do it. We had a couple of meetings in between. And now, what is it, 5 years later?
Yeah, boy, it's hard to believe. Time has gone by very quickly.
Yeah, so I really want to thank you for that meeting. I don't know if I would have done it as soon as I pulled the trigger on it if you didn't push me and it was the right time. I mean, everything happens in the right time, but that especially because I was able to launch 2 groups right before COVID. And I think everybody in those original 2 groups would agree COVID would have been a lot harder to navigate if we did not have all the collective knowledge of each other. And we were all doing this for the first time. Nobody had a playbook for COVID. So we had to figure out how to write policies, how we were going to, what happens if somebody got COVID? Do we need to shut the office down? How do we notify that? And we were able to do that as a group, not as an individual. So thank you for pushing me towards that. A lot of people got the benefit of it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Very welcome.
And Tim, you and I meet on a regular basis. One of my favorite questions that you ask is, what have you been reading? I think you've asked that every single time that I have met you. And recently, you were telling me about a book that you have read. And of course, the book is on hiring. I believe it's Foolproof Hiring, Powerful Proven Keys to Hiring High Performers. Did I say that right?
Yes, that's it.
So, and with that, you and I have spoken at length. How do we keep our high performers? How do we make sure that people are happy here? It's a great workplace, that we're doing everything that we can to keep people here, because the brutal fact is there's not really that many people out there to replace them anymore. We're in this demographic drought. We're not having people apply for jobs as they once did. So we need to keep all of these people happy. And you helped us quite a bit with that on episode 280. But we're going to shift gears a little bit, if I understand, on this episode. And we're going to talk about, how do we attract those high performers to our businesses?
Yeah, it's how do we attract them, and then how do we reel them in? How do we secure that talent? I think those are the two key things now.
So would you say that since you came by for a visit on episode 280, that we have seen a shift where there are more people back in the marketplace? They are looking for jobs and it's not as dire as it once was?
Yes, I would agree with that. We went through, of course, COVID, and then the Great Resignation, when so many employees, for different reasons, decided they wanted to leave the labor market. They wanted to take a break, or they wanted to retire, or they wanted to just relax for a little bit. And that took place for about 6 to 12 months. And then we started seeing, then we had the Great Return. And we began to see employees come back, whether it was to their own company or they were going into different industries, different jobs, but they decided, again, en masse to come back. And fortunately, the result of that is, I think most business owners would tell you today, the labor market has improved over the last 12 months. There seems to be more and better candidates available. It doesn't mean that it's a good market, but it has certainly improved over the last year to year and a half.
Tim, what emerging trends do you see in the hiring landscape?
Trace, there are a couple things that I see. One, I referenced earlier. I think the labor market in general has improved for small and mid-sized companies. It's rare that I talk to a business owner who says, I can't find this person, or I'm having trouble getting enough of these people, but it seems to be improved. I think second is that businesses have learned that they're having to do things differently than they did before COVID. They're having to look in different places. I like to say fish in different ponds, meaning that if they weren't hiring people, right out of college, maybe now they're having to hire people with less experience, or they're having to look for people in different markets to come to their market, or people with different education, different skill levels. So they've had to expand their reach and their vision in terms of hiring today. And then third is they're finding that they're having to be more flexible in their hiring, more flexible in terms of maybe that instead of working 5 days, it's working 4 days. Instead of working in the office, it's maybe a hybrid of working from home and working in the office. Flexibility in terms of just the nature of the job, maybe in the way that it's crafted. So just being more flexible with employees in the job and the responsibilities. I think companies are finding themselves just being more flexible.
Tim, the remote work issue is looked at differently upon several people. There's one camp where as long as the work is getting done, it really doesn't matter where the person is doing it. And then there are other people that say, nope, I've got to have that person in their seat in this office in order to know that they're working. I know there's everything in between that as well, but a lot of people are moving to remote work, especially after COVID. So, where do those two camps land these days?
Yeah. That's a great question, and one that seems to come up quite often. I wrote I write a monthly newsletter, Small Business Matters, and I wrote an article about this last month. And what I said is that I think the business owners in large are asking the wrong question, because the question they're asking is, should they be working from the office? Should they be working from home? Should it be some type of hybrid situation? And again, I think that's the wrong question. I think the better question that business owners should be asking is, do I trust my employees? Because if I trust Trace is one of my employees, and he understands what his job is, and he understands what I expect from this job, and he's agreed to that, then who am I to tell him to work in the office or work from home or do both? All I say is Trace, do what you've got to do to achieve these results, the ones that you and I have agreed upon. And I trust that you can then figure out on your own how that looks in terms of where you're working and how you're working, when you're working. But it comes down to, do I trust my employees? Because if I don't trust my employees, then I have to tell them. I have to tell them, okay, on Mondays and Thursdays, you're coming to the office, and Tuesday, Wednesdays, you get to work from home, and Friday, we'll flip a coin. If I don't trust my employees, I've got to be looking over their shoulder. I've got to be micromanaging them. I've got to be telling them, what to do and when to do. So again, I think the bigger question, and it's maybe a more difficult question for a business owner, is, do I trust my employees?
I remember we had a speaker at one of the All City Vistage meetings where he was talking about unlimited paid time off. And he had the same message that if you trust your people to do the things that they need to get done, then they should be able to take as much time off as they need, providing that they're doing all the work and not loading it up more on somebody else. I'm kind of curious. That seems like the same mindset that we're talking about here. Are there a lot of companies that are doing unlimited paid time off as well?
Certainly more now. Before COVID, I've been talking about this in different settings for 15 or more years. This idea of allowing employees to make their own decisions about when to work, how to work, where to work. And when I first began talking about it, people would throw things at me. They would say, well, that would never work in my business, maybe a retail setting or a manufacturer setting. And my response was, I think it can work anywhere if you have the right employees and the right structure in place in terms of processes and procedures. And then, of course, COVID hit, and we went from a relatively small 15%, I think, or so of employees, working from home to 2/3 of employees working from home. And all of a sudden, employers found that in some cases this worked pretty well. That essentially, Tracy, comes down to, as a leader, as a manager, do I want to manage or regulate someone's time, or do I want to manage their work? And I don't know about it. It comes down to, do I want to manage compliance or do I want to manage performance? And I don't know about you, I would much rather manage an employee's performance than manage their compliance. Compliance meaning, okay, you've got to be at your desk at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'll give you a 10-minute break and then lunch between 12 and 12:30, but you better be back to your desk by 12:30. That's compliance. That's bad. That goes back to the agriculture industry. You had to be in the fields because of the time, the sun would come up. At one point, the sun would go down, and so we had to regulate, when people worked. Well, today, our employees many of them now are what are referred to as knowledge workers. They're not making stuff so much as they're using their mind. And given that, how important is it if they're sitting at my desk or your desk when they're doing that work, as long as they're performing? And so it's not happening fast, and some leaders are coming to this quicker than others, but the train has left the station. We're not going backwards. And particularly for younger employees, the first thing that gets their attention in a job listing is, do I get to work from home or not? That's the first thing. Is it virtual, or is it hybrid, or is it work in the office? And if that's not in the job listing, then for many young employees, they go to the next job listing. They're just going to ignore that listing because they want to have flexibility. They want to have options in terms of where they're working. And companies that are slow or not receptive to that idea are missing out on a significant portion of the labor pool.
Well, speaking of listings, what are some key elements that we need to make sure that we're correctly and clearly defining when we are writing whatever ad for the position that we're trying to fill?
Well, one is, as I mentioned, is what are the expectations in terms of where the job will be conducted. I think in addition to that, and I advise my clients to be very clear about the expectations for results in this position. If you're looking for a salesperson to bring in $1 million in sales, put that in the job listing. Because now, instead of someone who's only capable of producing $100,000 in sales, they're not going to apply. If you've set the bar and said, you need to bring in at least have a history of bringing in $1 million in annual sales, then people who are going to respond to that are going to have had a history in that regard. So be specific about the results that you're looking for. I would even put it in the job heading. We're looking for Atlanta's best salesperson with a history of producing $1 million in sales. So now, again, only the people who have that most likely are going to respond to the ad versus 100 people who have no experience in sales or producing sales. So job expectation. Where's the job going to take place? Is there flexibility? To what degree is there flexibility in the job? And particularly for younger employees, they're interested in opportunities for growth. And what are the opportunities for growth in this position? Am I going to start off as a clerk, but then maybe have an opportunity to become a manager? Is this a management position and I have an opportunity to become a vice president? What are the opportunities for growth, particularly for younger employees? Very important.
Tim, there's so many platforms out there to post job listings. Which ones should we be using and why?
Yeah, Indeed seems to be the front runner, continue to be the front runner at this point. LinkedIn, I think, again, depending on the size company, the industry, LinkedIn, I think, is also a good place to post. I suggest to my clients to put their job listings on their own website. It's interesting to me how many companies fail to have a career page on their website with their listing openings. I think that's a good idea. I think if there's a local college or university, many times those institutions have a job office and they have an online presence, and that might be a good place to put a listing. It's identifying who you're looking for, where you're looking, and saying, okay, where do those people hang out? And if they're hanging out on a particular website, if they're hanging out at a particular organization, then I want to get my listing in that place.
And the workforce now consists of, is it 4 generations? We've got the boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Zs. Did I name them all?
I think so. I think we have 4 or 5 now for the first time ever in the workplace. Yeah.
Now, all of those are looking for something different. So is it realistic to say that we could do that with one listing?
Probably not. And that's why I think I would want to be mindful of the demographics of what I'm looking for in terms of age, education, skill levels, what generation do they fall into. I think what we're finding, particularly with younger employees today, there are 3 things that seem to be really important. And I've already referenced a couple of them. One is there flexibility in this position? Second is, are there growth opportunities? I understand I may start in this job, but are there opportunities for growth? And then third is how purposeful is this company? And this is not something that we used to talk much about. Is, does this company have a strong mission, a strong purpose? But what we're finding with younger employees, this is particularly important, to the point where many of them would take a job with less pay if they can work for a company with a strong purpose or mission, where they feel like their work is contributing to something larger, something more significant. So one, that means that companies need to be clear about what is their purpose, what is their mission, and be able to communicate that in such a way to a potential hire that they feel like, hey, I may not be making as much money in this job, but I'm doing something important, and that's meaningful to me.
Tim, we're going to turn this into one of our coaching sessions. So when I'm telling somebody about our firm, I have a tendency to want to sell them on it because I'm a galvanizer. But that's not what you're supposed to be doing on the interview. So how do I make sure that somebody knows that there is purpose here, and I love being here and I love leading this tribe, but I'm not leading them to say yes when the answer should have been no?
Boy, that's a great question. I think knowing you and your energy, your exuberance, your passion, that's going to show up really quickly in a job interview. And what that suggests to the candidate is that there is a purpose to what these guys are doing. There must, because of the way he expresses himself, the way he communicates about this company. And then secondly is I think you want to lead, instead of leading with, well, we do water testing. It's, we're all about ensuring, the water quality for thousands of people in these buildings and companies that we work with, that it's safe for them to work at, expressing, the why in your work versus the what in your work. Because in today's world, they're far more interested in the why than the what. And so I think you want to lead with that. And I think that's going to play really well, again, particularly with younger employees.
One of the books you recommended that I read several years ago was Simon Sinek's Start With Why. I just want to put a plug for that because that really changed how I talk to everybody about what it was that we do. So we'll make sure to put a link in the show notes page for that. Tim, speaking of the interview, some interviews are better than others. What should we be doing during the interview?
It's my belief that, when I go into an interview, there are 3 questions that I want to be able to answer about this candidate. And those 3 questions are, can he or she do the job? Do they have the skills, the experience? Can they do the job? Can they do the job here? They may have been a superstar at Acme Incorporated, but this is not Acme Incorporated. This is Tim Incorporated. And can they do job here with this company? And then the third question is, can they do the job with me? Because again, they may have been very successful working with their old manager or leader, but I'm not that old manager. I'm not that old leader. And can they be successful working for me? So typically that first question, can they do the job? We usually answer that, with the candidate's resume. What is their experience? What is their education? What have their accomplishments been? And usually the first interview, usually the screening interview, is all around, can they do the job? And then maybe I'll give them a test of some skills test of some sort to confirm my answer to that question. But it's the second question, third question, I think are far more important. And those usually get answered in the second interview. There's an old saying, and Trace, you may remember that: we hire people for their skills, we fire them for their behavior. Because we assume that if they can do the job, if they have the skills, that we just assume they're going to be a good fit, right? Who would not be a good fit with my company? Well, as it turns out, a lot of people may not be a good fit for my company. And so it's that second interview when I begin talking about our culture, which is usually a function of our core values. Core values are, the guiding principles, within my company. And what I tell my clients is, in that second interview, at least 50% of that second interview should be all about those core values. is Trace a good fit? Will he be a good fit within my company? And so, as an example, if I have 5 core values, and usually it should be a limited number, if I have 5 core values, my rule of thumb is if I'm interviewing someone, there should be a complete fit with 3 of the core values, a positive fit with the 4th core value, and I'm going to call it a neutral fit on the 5th core value. Neutral meaning they're not anti. Let's say the core value is competition. We love to compete. So neutral fit would be, well, I don't. It's not that I don't like to compete. It's just I'm maybe not as competitive as Tim is.
And Nation, Tim is very competitive. Just play any game with him.
So 100% fit on 3 core values, positive fit on a 4th, neutral on a 5th. And if I can do that, if I can find someone in that line, I've got the right person. The other thing that's interesting, and this came out of this book, Foolproof Hiring, that I thought was so interesting, is that I don't know that this is generational, but the research suggests over 50% of the candidates that I interview are going to be dishonest. And when I read that, I thought, how could that be? And then I thought about many of the interviews that I had, that there was a little white lie in there somewhere, maybe something on their resume that wasn't quite accurate, maybe some experience they shared with me in the interview that wasn't quite as good as what they said. But over 50% of the candidates there's going to be some bit of dishonesty in the interview. And part of my job in the interview is to figure out, is this person being honest? Is he or she telling me the truth? And that's not always easy. There are people who do that as a profession, and in reading deceptive behavior. So, but as best as you and I can, we've got to figure out, is this person being honest? Because if they're not being honest in the interview, you can imagine what happens once I hire that person. It's not like all of a sudden they become completely honest. That's unlikely. So one of the tricks that came out of this book that I love is, and there's a name for it. It's called the truth motivator. I like that, the truth motivator. And what the author suggests, this is Brad Smart, he suggests that in the beginning of the second interview, I say the following. I say, Trace, if this process continues up to making an offer to you, I'm going to ask you for several references, and you're going to be responsible for arranging those references with the people that I choose. Is that clear? And you would nod your head. You'd say, sure, that makes sense. I'm going to have to provide you with references. Well, it's interesting to me that number one, I ask people, business owners, do you ask for references? And how many business owners do not ask for references? And that just boggles my mind. But secondly, if they do ask for references, they allow the candidate to provide their own references. So who do they provide? They provide a family member. They provide a next door neighbor, their college roommate, all of whom, of course, are going to give glowing reviews on this candidate. Well, that's of no use to me. So instead, as I'm going through the course of the interview with you, that second interview, and you mentioned that the manager that you worked for last, you mentioned the client that you got along so well with, you mentioned the direct report that you had some issues with. Those are the people that I want to talk to in terms of references. So when you and I finish, I'm going to say, Trace, I want you to arrange an interview. I'm not going to do it. You're going to set this up for me to meet with that customer, that direct report, that last manager, and just let them know that, you've applied for this job and I've asked for them as references. And what's interesting, what the research shows is the honesty of the candidate goes way up, because they know that everything they're telling me in this interview, I'm going to fact check with these individuals. And if they're lying to me, I'm going to find out. And I think it's a brilliant mechanism for ensuring that I'm getting as truthful as information in the job interview as possible, just by making that statement that, when you and I are done, before I hire you, I'm going to ask for, and you're going to give me a handful of references that I plan on speaking to. I've always used references, but to try that line out, I can't wait to try that out.
Tim, that's fantastic. And these are the tips that you're giving me throughout our 15-year history together. So just making our business so much better. Thinking back, one of the tips you gave me years ago was an assessment for us to use when we were hiring. I can't remember the company name, but there was something in there and it says, are they faking it? And there was like a faking score to that. Do you still recommend assessments like that?
I do, and I'm careful. I'm careful to recommend. I definitely recommend usually a behavioral assessment, whether it's a Myers-Briggs, it's a DISC, it's a predictive index. I think some are better than others in terms of the hiring process. And yet, what I tell my clients is you don't want to allow the assessment to make the hiring decision. It's not going to tell you, yes, I should hire Tim, or no, I shouldn't hire Trace. What it should do instead is it should support my own conclusions about Tim as a candidate. If I've come to believe that, he's more of a long-term thinker than short-term thinker, that he's more of a decision maker than a reactionary, because we just tend to make those assumptions after we've spoken with someone. A good behavioral assessment will reinforce those assumptions. So, and just as important is then post-hire, a good assessment will say, okay, once I've hired Trace, he needs to work on, becoming more decisive. He needs to work on, becoming a better coach with his employees. So those assessments can be very helpful in post-hire training and coaching. That's why I think they can be equally helpful there. But yeah, I still recommend them as part of the hiring process as well.
Another tip that you gave us, and this was years ago. Again, we tell time in COVID. It was several years before COVID. We had a tremendous amount of activity on a posting that we had listed. And so much so, it was difficult to whittle through all the candidates. And it was also very time consuming. And one of the recommendations that you gave to me was do a group interview. And I will tell you, that intimidated me, but we did it. And it was genius because now people were competing against each other. And I kind of wondered how much of it was for show for the other people or to show off for me. But there were things that came out, and there was also a hustle that came afterwards where if I asked people to do something, it was now I've got to get this to them first. So my question is, if somebody's going to do that group interview, what are the parameters that they should be using? And is it still appropriate post-COVID?
A couple thoughts there, Trace. One is when I think of group interviews, it can go either way. One, a group of us interviewing you on an individual basis. The book Foolproof Hiring that I reference, they recommend that you should always interview in pairs, that there should always be two people conducting the interview for a number of different reasons. That one is that you get two different perspectives on the candidate. You also take turns asking questions, so it allows the other person to be thinking ahead in terms, okay, what do I want to ask and what am I? And I also get to witness the candidate responding to my partner's questions, so I'm getting to observe a little bit more than if it was just me interviewing you. And then on the flip side is what you were referencing is doing group interviews where let's say I've narrowed the field down to three candidates. I've got three folks that I think maybe all three could do the job, but I can only pick one. So now I bring them all together and I interview them together. And I get to compare and contrast each of them shoulder to shoulder. And I continue to do this because I just find it really interesting and helpful to interview at them at the same time and to be able to see them answering the same question, one after another, and be able to compare. Okay, how do they interact with me? How do they interact with each other? So I think it's just as useful of a tool today as it was 4 or 5 years ago. Is it necessary? I think some positions it may be more valuable as we go up the food chain, so to speak, of jobs. For a blue collar person doing warehouse work, would I need to do that? Maybe not. But if I were hiring a senior vice president and again, I'm looking for the best candidate out of a group of 3 or 4, I think I would still do that.
When we did it, it was more nerve-wracking of the regular interview than we normally did, but it was very interesting, the results. And we haven't done it post-COVID. Maybe we need to look at that if we have 3 candidates that we're choosing from next time. A question I now have, let's say in this example, we did have 3 candidates and we couldn't hire all of them, but we did hire one. How do we now ensure that we made the right decision?
What I encourage, if particularly if I'm using multiple people to interview, is to create a scorecard. I'm going to score people on their skills, their expertise, and to have everyone give a number score for each candidate on each skill. I suggest to my clients to identify a minimum of 5 skills or competencies for every job. What do they need to be able to do to be successful in this job? And then we score them on each of the skills, each of us. And then second is to score them on we mentioned core values, and score them on their alignment with our core values. So that if I'm scoring on 5 core values and 5 skills, and I'm scoring on a scale of 1 to 10, so the maximum would be 100. And so when we're all done, and there are 3 of us that have conducted the interview, then we compare our scores. And one, we establish what's a minimum in terms of, we don't hire anybody below X. I normally recommend below 70. For you, it may be 80 or something. We determine a minimum, but then we compare scores. And then we might talk amongst ourselves and say, wow, you gave this person a 7 on this skill, and I gave him a 5. Why the difference? What did you see that I didn't see? I just think it's helpful because we're all hindered in making these decisions, and that we're all inherently biased. I like left-handed people, you like right-handed people. I like short people, you like tall people. I like people from the north, you like people from the south. We're all inherently biased, and those biases can't help but make their way into hiring decisions. So the more we're able to bring more and different people into the hiring decision, I think the better off we are, just to help overcome some of those natural biases that come into the hiring process.
There's a saying that goes something like hire slow, set free quickly. How do you ensure that now we've gone through this entire process, that the person understands the expectations are being met on both sides, and we don't go too terribly long if there is a disconnection?
I've used a very similar adage, hire slow, fire fast. We tend to do the exact opposite. We tend to hire way too fast. We tend to fire way too slow. But the hire slow, fire fast, I mentioned that, I guess, about 6 months ago. I was talking to a Vistage group, and in the audience was a CEO of a large staffing firm. And he interrupted me. He said, Tim, I've got it. I'm sorry, I've got to interrupt you. I said, I need to clarify what you said. You want to hire slow, but do it fast, and fire fast. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, in today's world, once you have made a hiring decision, you need to be prepared to act very quickly, because the candidates that you're talking to more than likely are speaking to 3, 4, 6 other companies, getting multiple offers. And if you're not prepared to act quickly on a hiring decision, you're at risk of losing that good candidate. So you want to hire slow, but do it fast once you've made a decision. The average hiring time, I think last thing I saw over the last 5 years, the average hiring period has been cut by about 5 days. So companies are finding themselves hiring quickly, I think, because of the dynamics of the labor pool that we talked about earlier. But what I tell my clients is try to build speed bumps into the hiring process. Multiple interviews, multiple people conducting interviews, checking references, using the behavioral assessment, because the cost of making a bad hire is way too expensive to rush into this. The average hire on the low side that I saw recently was 1 year's salary. So if this employee is going to make $50,000 a year, if I make a mistake in this hire, that's a $50,000 mistake. I don't know too many small businesses that can afford too many of those types of mistakes.
Tim, I know you have a podcast and a newsletter. Can you tell the Scaling Up Nation a bit about those?
Sure, thank you. The newsletter is called Small Business Matters. I've been publishing the newsletter now for I hate to think, over 25 years. I've been publishing the newsletter. It comes out once a month. It's free of charge. It's by subscription. Any of your listeners can find it on my website, which is smallbusinessmattersonline.com, smallbusinessmattersonline.com. I also started doing a podcast maybe 5, 6 years ago. It's called Small Business Matters as well. And about once a month, I interview someone who I just find interesting. It could be an author, it could be a speaker, it could be a small business owner. And my oldest son, Taylor, and I co host the podcast. And it's just fun. We just, like yourself, we have fun doing it. We get good guests. And we're fortunate enough that we typically end up getting good content for the listeners as well. But it's available on all your major platforms, Spotify, Apple, for podcasts. Small Business Matters.
We will make sure to have those links on our show notes page. Tim, I can't remember how many times you've been on the program. So you're on round 4, I think, of the lightning round. Are you ready?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
I think I'm ready.
So now if you get them wrong, there's penalties involved. So just be careful. Round 4 is serious.
All right.
One of my favorite questions, and I alluded to this earlier, is what are you reading? So I want to twist that a little bit, and I'm making up my own questions. You're looking at your notes, but these are things that I'm just going to throw right at you. Again, we're on round 4 here. If you were on a desert island and you could only take, say, 3 books with you, what would those books be?
Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That was the first business book I ever read, a couple years out of college. And it really changed my mindset, my thinking around just life in general and how I wanted to conduct my life. So, and I've reread it, I don't know how many different times. So I'd bring that along. I'd bring along something by Jim Collins. He's one of my favorite authors, Good to Great, probably most famous for. And I find myself reading and rereading his books on a frequent basis. So then that's going to leave me with a third book. You mentioned Seth Godin earlier, and I've read a number of his books. And whenever I read one of Seth Godin's books, my head hurts. So if I'm on that island, if I don't have access to aspirin or painkiller, I'd still go with Seth Godin just because he makes me think harder than most authors, maybe of any author.
Over the next year, what are you looking forward to most?
Oh, you may know that. I know you know this, is I have walked the El Camino Santiago in Spain on 3 different occasions, which is crazy by itself. And if your listeners aren't familiar, it's been around for centuries. There's about a dozen different walks. They all end up in Santiago, Spain. The most popular walk is a 500-mile walk. I've done that one twice. I did the one from Lisbon once. This summer, it's called the Camino Norte, which is a walk that goes along the northern coast of Spain, starts in San Sebastian and works its way along the northern coast and then dips down into Santiago again. And I leave on May 28th, and I'll be gone for a month. I can't wait.
Tim, this is one of your questions. I've heard you ask this. You've asked this to me. What would you say your superpower is? I love turning the tables on you.
Yeah. Curiosity. I had 6 meetings today, 6 coaching sessions. And I woke up this morning thinking, how am I going to make it? And you've been in the same position. How am I going to make it through 6 coaching sessions? And all I did was allow my curiosity to take over. And just as you do beautifully, is just being curious and asking questions, and then being more curious and asking more questions. And I've honed that over time. I've got more work to do, but I think just being curious and being willing to ask that question that's burning in my head that says, don't ask, and then I'll ask. And then it sets off a whole nother round of questions. I think it's my curiosity.
Tim, I would say I would answer that the exact same way for you. I've been the beneficiary of your questions. And I think I said on a previous episode, you've never given me any advice, and I've done the best things from our meetings, and you've never once told me what to do. It's all in your questions. You are fantastic at the questions that you ask.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of magic, you now have a magic wand, and you can change anything in the world. What would you change?
This is going to be controversial. We may lose half your audience.
Oh, no.
I have a different perspective on the immigration question. You can't pick up the newspaper without reading about immigration and who should come in and why they should come in and such. It's a hot issue, and so that's why I'm reluctant sometimes to bring this up. But I have a different opinion than most. I think we should, rather than limit immigration, we should figure out ways to increase immigration in this country. Because what's driving our economy currently, and this is not me speaking, these are the best economists, what's driving the American economy today is immigration. It's people coming to this country and opening new businesses. The vast majority of new businesses in this country are being opened by immigrants. The consumption of goods and services in this country is being driven by immigrants. Innovations, new ideas in this country are being driven by immigrants. And yet we want to limit that. And it just, I don't understand it. I think it's mostly, and these are friends of mine, colleagues, family members, and I think it's driven by fear. And if it's something I've learned over time is the understanding that the fear is the world's greatest motivator. It's what drives most decisions. When I have a coaching client and they're stuck, one of my first questions is always, what are you fearful of? And I think fear is driving this particular issue. And what I see going on is, we have a lot of immigrants that come to the U.S. for college and university. We remain the hotspot in the world for education. And yet what's happening now is they're coming here to study, and then they're going to Canada, or they're going to Australia, or they're going to Italy to start their businesses. We're educating them, but they're taking their entrepreneurship to different countries. And that pains me, because I want the U.S. to be the center of entrepreneurship. And we're losing that. And we're losing that because of this fear around immigration. And I'm hopeful, maybe my magic wand, that this will change. There's a pendulum to a lot of issues. And certainly the pendulum has gone way towards a anti-immigrant. And I think that's unfortunate. I'm not going to change that, but I think that's unfortunate. And so I'm hoping that pendulum will swing back one day.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when we can get that out there, when we can talk about it, when we talk, we can solve anything. And I think when we just think about something generically, it is fear-based, but everybody knows that one person, that if you knew this one person, you wouldn't like that law. You wouldn't think what we were doing is correct, because now we have empathy. And we've got to figure out how to swing that pendulum back, so we're talking about things with empathy, and we're talking about things that are hard to talk about.
Very much so.
Thank you, Tim, as always, for mixing things up on the Scaling Up H2O podcast. I have learned so much from you throughout the years, and you're one of the reasons that I decided to start this podcast. This was, I think, a result of one of the issues. I was thinking about, hey, what could I do next in one of our Vistage sessions? And the podcast came out about that. And you guys had to explain to me what a podcast was, because I didn't know at the time. So I want to thank you for just being such a mentor, such a guide throughout my life, and sharing some of those experiences with the Scaling Up Nation.
Trace, very welcome, and I hope you'll have me back again. I look forward to coming back again.
Nation, I am sure that you can tell I appreciate that man so much. Tim Fulton has just been such a help to me in life, in business. I've known Tim for so many years, and Tim has really helped me with one question. He talked about how he loves to ask questions and how curiosity is in his nature. He asked me a question at the end of that Grow Smart series that we talked about. And he said, Trace, let me ask you this. How do you know that you don't know something? And that question has just burned a hole in my brain since he's asked it. And I can't tell you how many books I've read because of that question, how many conferences I've attended because of that question. How many people that I introduced myself, even though it was extremely awkward because of that question. That question just lit a fire under me. And I would say that this podcast is a product of this question. The mastermind is a product of that question. That was one of the best questions somebody has ever asked me. And the thing is, how do you know what you don't know? You don't know. And I have just spent the rest of my life trying to figure those things out. Now, of course, you're never going to know everything that you don't know. But that question, if that helps you as it's helped me, has read or allowed me to read so many books, I don't think I would be as avid of a reader as I am without that question. So, Tim, thank you for your curiosity. Thank you for that question. And thank you for, we're still trying to figure out how many times he's been on this podcast. At least 2. We're thinking 4. We're going to go with 4. And if you want to catch up with Tim on previous episodes, episode 22 was one of the very first ones that Tim was on. And then most recently, episode 280, which he talks about top talent. And I think the interview today, along with episode 280, are a great complement. Tim really has a great way with words and explaining very difficult subjects very simplistically, and especially giving you takeaways so you can immediately apply what we're talking about. So you heard that in today's interview. You're definitely going to hear that in the other episodes that I mentioned. And Tim is also one of those people that challenges me. It's always with a question. He never tells me what to do, except for the mastermind. Now, I was thinking about this when I made that comment earlier. I'll go ahead and tell the rest of that story. Tim and I met at a Chick-fil-A, and here in Atlanta, we have these special Chick-fil-A's called Dwarf Houses, and they're supposed to be a replica of the original Dwarf House, which was the restaurant that Chick-fil-A originally came from. So there are these sit-down Chick-fil-A restaurants called Dwarf Houses, and there's one over here by our office, and that's where Tim and I met. And we were talking about the mastermind, and it was right there during lunch where Tim said, we need to do this. And we both outlined how we were going to do the mastermind, and we helped each other outline how we were going to do each and every step at that lunch. And then we held each other accountable for that. Tim has a mastermind out of that. I have a mastermind out of that. And Nation, one of my favorite things besides this podcast is the mastermind. I get to meet with these incredible people each and every week. We have an issues processing track that we go through, and I know for a fact that the people that are involved in the mastermind are getting further and faster and having more fun than the average person in our industry, just because we get to share the experience with each other. Just because we get to help each other with past experiences so nobody ever has to start on the very first step. There are so many things that we do to try to make each other better people in every aspect of our lives. But the bottom line is that we are all friends, and we are friendly people helping each other get further faster. And Nation, I just love when Tuesdays and Wednesdays roll around each and every week to see all these wonderful people in the mastermind. So Nation, if that is something that you want to check out, and maybe the Rising Tide Mastermind is not right for you, but I promise there's one out there that is. But if you want to check out the Rising Tide Mastermind, you can go to risingtidemastermind.team, or you can go to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind to find out more. And if it sounds like something you want to learn more about, then I would be happy to call you to tell you all about it and see if the mastermind is right for you and you are right for the mastermind. We just had our live event last month, and we had some incredible speakers come in. And I tell you, we always have some sort of challenging assignment that we do that makes us better on the other side. It was so much fun with that assignment. And it was just amazing to see all the people come together, because we get to see each other in person during that week. And our speakers motivated us to be better at the things that we were doing. And I think everybody left, everybody went home, and they immediately were able to put those things into action. I know I am better because I am a member of that mastermind group. And I hope everybody in that mastermind group can say the same thing. Tim also mentioned that he has a newsletter, and I love his newsletter. I had no idea it had been around for 25 years, but I want to have a link for that on our show notes page. I get so many great topics from his newsletter, so you might want to check that out. And then also his podcast is called Small Business Matters. And I had the honor of being on one of his earlier podcasts. It was called Creating a Positive Culture with Trace Blackmore. And I want to say it was probably his 10th episode. It was one of the early ones. So, as always, Tim, thank you for including me on the endeavors that you are working on. And thank you for being a coach throughout all the things that you have coached me on. Somebody that I think is a coach to all of us, that tries to challenge us each and every week, is our friend James McDonald. So here's a new Drop by Drop with James.
Welcome to Drop by Drop with James, the podcast segment where we wonder, explore, think about, imagine, and learn industrial water treatment, you guessed it, drop by drop, together. In today's segment, I have a challenge for you.
Challenge accepted.
The challenge is to ask your customer what you can do better. I mean to walk up to your customer, look them in the eye, and tell them not to hold back, and ask them what you could be doing better for them. If they give you positive feedback, great. If they unload all their pent-up frustration upon you, thank them for taking the time and caring enough to share their thoughts with you. Then take the time to give careful consideration to the feedback you received, even if it offends you at first. Try to have empathy with the customer to understand where they are coming from. Then use this moment to grow and become better. Communication is a two-way street, so be sure to let them know how you have reflected upon and implemented any relevant advice. I'm James McDonald, and I want to encourage you to be like water by forming bonds with those around you, dissolving new knowledge, and making worthy ripples, drop by drop.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Scaling Up Nation. I am so happy that you have decided to spend the last hour listening to this podcast. Hey, we've got 360 something more. Listen to another one before you get out of the car. And Nation, thank you for being part of the Scaling Up Nation. We'll have a brand new episode for you next week. Until then, take care, everybody.